Hey y'all, it's Tracy Adams here, and I am going to talk to you about insulin, our fat storing hormone, okay? So before I talk about insulin specifically, I just want to get you to think about something. It wasn't until this last century that humans had such ample access to food. And I use that term food loosely because we know a lot of the processed stuff that is on the market today, thanks to commercialization, isn't really food, but it's food. It's what people eat, all right? So I said this to a colleague this weekend, and I think it applies very well to what we're talking about now. And that is, humans were created in the image of God pre-Monsanto, okay? We were not made to eat so much, and we were not made to eat so often. And by eating as often as we do and what we eat, we're raising our insulin levels all day long. And guess what? Like I said before, insulin is our fat storing hormone, okay? Dr. Jason Fung, he wrote the book, The Obesity Code, Unlocking the Secrets of Weight Loss. And I'm currently reading that book. It's a great book. But he spends an entire chapter in his book on the topic of how insulin causes you to get fat, okay? He cites clinical trial after clinical trial that proves over and over again that insulin will make you fat. So I'm going to quote him here, so I'm going to have to read from my computer, but I think this is worth sharing. All right, so, and this is just one example. All right, in the landmark 1993 Diabetes Control and Complications trial, researchers compared a standard dose of insulin to a high dose designed to tightly control blood sugars in type 1 diabetic patients. Type 1 are patients that are born with out the ability to create enough insulin. Type 2 is what you get from lifestyle, diet, and I use those definitions loosely, but I'm just differentiating for those of you who don't know the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. At the end of 6 years, the study proved that intensive control of blood sugars resulted in fewer complications for those patients. However, what happened to their weight? Participants in the high dose group gained on average approximately 9.8 pounds more than the participants in the standard group. Yowzers, that's in the book. More than 30% of patients experienced major weight gain. Prior to the study, both groups were more or less equal in weight with little obesity. The only difference between the groups was the amount of insulin administered. Were these patients suddenly lacking in willpower? Were they lazier than they had been before the study? Were they more gluttonous? No, no, and no. Insulin levels were increased. Patients gained weight. So even though my husband, who has sold insulin for 11 years, and obviously it's a much needed product, but he rolls his eyes at me when I say insulin makes you fat, and he responds, insulin causes weight gain. What's the difference? For all intents and purposes, insulin's the fat storing hormone. So here's a little bit more information for you about insulin, and this is from Dr. Joe Mercola. If you haven't heard of him, he's a well-known and highly respected intervention or functional medicine doctor. His website's been around since the 90s. So here's what he has to say about insulin, and there's a whole lot more here, but I'm just giving you a couple snippets. Insulin's evolutionary purpose is to store excess nutrients. We come from a time of feast and famine, when if we couldn't store the excess energy during times of feasting, we would not be here because all of our ancestors would have died from famine. Humans have had to store nutrients throughout the centuries. They were able to do this because their bodies would release insulin in response to any elevation in energy that they consumed. So when your sugar is elevated, it's a sign that your body that you've got more than you need, and so it releases insulin and says, go ahead boys, store the fat. I made that part up. Dr. Mercola didn't add that in, but just trying to keep it interesting. So he goes on to list disease after disease after disease that is actually caused by insulin resistance issues. Like he's like, I mean, it's incredible, all of the things that he's like, if you could get insulin levels normal, then this wouldn't happen, and blah, blah, blah. So take home message is insulin is not to be messed with. Seriously. So here's what we know. Insulin is the hormone that also turns glucose into energy that can be used by our bodies. Eating carbs raises our insulin levels, and we create glucose, stored as glycogen and then as fat. So using glucose as food makes us, as we have reviewed in another video, it makes us sugar burners, okay? It's a form of sugar. Glucose is a form of sugar. Think about it. Lactose is the sugar in milk. Fructose is the sugar in fruit. Maltose is the sugar in beer. Yum, yum. So we know glucose is a sugar. Energy from glucose is fast acting, and so the body is able to process it quickly, and that's just the way it goes first. That's what it does. So we also know that it's not the only thing that the body can use for fuel, but it's just the easiest thing that it uses. Fat takes a little bit longer to turn into energy, so given the choice, the body will prefer to process glucose right now and store the fat that we eat for later. And that is why eating fat and carbs together makes people gain weight. It's pretty simple. The body will process the glucose super quickly and store the fat for later in case of emergency, because it wasn't that long ago that humans lived in a feast or famine type of world. So that is where intermittent fasting and eating a higher fat, lower carb diet comes in. When you eat ample amounts of fat, you show your body you are in a plentiful environment. There's no need to keep hoarding this, okay? With this, the body stops producing so much insulin, which again is the fat storing hormone, and we produce more ketones, which then get to work processing fat. And that is whether it's fat you've eaten or fat off of the old body, okay? So I hope that all that I've talked about with insulin this evening, helps you connect the dots on just how important it is to be able to get your insulin levels under control. Intermittent fasting and eating a high fat, low carb diet for a while can really help you do that. And that's all I have on insulin. So I'm gonna give a pop quiz later, and I'm gonna ask, what is insulin? And you're gonna tell me it's the what hormone? You better know. All right, I'll see y'all later.